Hey, everybody, and welcome to Red May on the last day of May and the end of your 1 month vacation from capitalism. Well, almost. We have two more events. We'd like to start by sending out a massive wave of solidarity to our brothers and sisters, our compañeros y compañeras, who are down at the uprising, which is happening in all the cities of the US now. Stay safe and about 30 feet ahead of the cops. We have two events left after this that are kind of special June events that were rescheduled. One of them is next Friday at 1 p.m. That's June 5th. After geoengineering, we have Dan Denvir, who is going to be the host of Jacobin's podcast, The Dig. We'll be interviewing Holly Jean Buck, who you remember from Climate Crisis panel. She has a great book called After Geoengineering. So that's next Friday at 1 p.m. And we're also going to reschedule the COVID-19 and the carceral state panel. So go to Red May on YouTube and our TV, Red May TV, and check out the word when we've got it scheduled. And also while you're there, well, give us some money. This is our last day of the drive. We're at 3,815. If we can just get over 4,000, we will have paid off this year's festival, and we'll be a third of the way on to paying off next year, and we'll have about a year to gather it together. So it's a good day to give and just put us over 4,000. Go to www.redmayseattle.org. So without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator for today, Jaskiran Dhillon, who's an anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty Six Cree Territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Her work has been published in The Guardian, Cultural Anthropology, Truth Out, Public Seminar, Feminist Formations, Environment and Society, Social Texts, and Decolonization, among many other venues. She's the author of Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization and the Politics of Intervention from 2017, and co-editor of Standing with Standing Rock, which is a good place to be standing. That's voices from the No DAPL movement. And the co-editor, of course, or other co-editor is Nick Estes, who's been on a few panels here. Jaskiran's an associate professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School in New York City. Jaskiran, take it away.
Hi, everyone. A warm welcome to everyone joining us today, wherever you are. I want to start by thanking Philip and Sean for all of their work to organize this event, and to the entire crew at Red May for keeping Red May alive in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I know wasn't an easy task. Our collective thinking, imagining, and action is more urgent than ever. And I know that many of us have been involved in the uprisings and demonstrations across the United States against the anti-Black violence and the recent murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We know that colonial state violence, as it is manifested through colonial laws and law enforcement agencies, has a history that is centuries old. It is, in fact, fundamental to the creation of US territorial borders. We also know, however, that in the face of such violence, people refuse to surrender and accept the terms of oppression. They refuse to disappear. It's an honor to be moderating this event today. I'm speaking to you from my home in West Philadelphia, a city built on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people. I just want to take a moment to thank my fellow panelists in advance for their deep commitments to their respective political work and for taking the time and care to share their knowledge and reflections with us. In terms of the flow for today's event, this is what you can expect. I'm going to start with some really brief opening remarks, and then we're going to hear from each of our 5 speakers. And this will be followed by some time for the speakers to engage with one another. And we'll close out the event by taking questions from the chat. So please be as specific as you can in the questions you're asking so that we can get as many of your provocations on the table as possible. We have a really stellar group of speakers lined up for today, and they are going to think with me and all of you who are listening about the politics and violence of borders, the social, political, historic, legal, capitalist, and geographic lines of containment, inclusion, and expulsion that mediate so much of how our world is organized, for whom and under what conditions. Borders are one of the most clear and present markers of the ongoing violence of colonial displacements due to climate change, land dispossession and extractivism, capitalist circulations that are required for colonialism and imperialism to function, labor inequalities and related forms of stratification, and the deep and profound structural inequalities and hierarchies of race, class, gender, ability, citizenship status that continue to produce the stakes of life or death for millions of people across the planet. Harsha Walia, one of our speakers for today, offers this important frame for thinking about borders in her groundbreaking book, Undoing Border Imperialism. Thanks for this, Harsha. Quote, an analysis of border imperialism encapsulates a dual critique of Western state building with global empire. The role of Western imperialism in dispossessing communities in order to secure land and resources for the state and capital interests, as well as deliberately limited inclusion of migrant bodies into Western states through processes of criminalization and racialization that justify the commodification of their labor. Western states, thus, are major arbiters in determining if and under what conditions people migrate. Here on Turtle Island, we are familiar with the ways that the constructions of settler colonial borders require ongoing and immense violence against Indigenous nations, Black communities, migrants who are fleeing from injustice and war in their home countries, wars in which the United States government almost certainly has a hand, and immigrant communities of color. Our comrades at the Red Nation also remind us of the ways that the violence of border control is consistently reconstituted and reproduced within the territorial boundaries of a settler colony through Indigenous land dispossession and rampant colonial gender violence that has resulted in the creation of border towns and related forms of border town violence. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, border towns refers to the settlements, sometimes small towns, sometimes large cities that adjoin reservation lands. So by centering the framework of border town violence, our comrades at the Red Nation extend and sharpen our critical understanding and push us to think more expansively about what actually constitutes the border. And in the midst of all of this, of course, COVID-19 enters, a global pandemic that once again has highlighted the profound social, political, historic, and economic inequalities we are facing. So we have our work cut out for us. So with that sort of frame, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. So our first speaker today is, just give me a second to check my notes since we've juggled this a bit, is S. Charu Sheila, who is a professor of interdisciplinary arts and sciences and co-director of the MA in Cultural Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. She is past editor and current advisory board member of Rethinking Marxism. Go ahead, Charu, over to you. You're still muted.
Let me unmute myself. Hello, everyone. I'd like to open by first recognizing that I live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. I recognize that the University of Washington Bothell, which is where I earn my living, was built upon the unceded homeland of the Willows, Mamish people. The campus also touches the shared waters of the tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, and I'm grateful to be a guest in these lands. Commit to showing solidarity for the continued fight for Indigenous sovereignty. Anything I say does not actually reflect my academic position. These are my own views, and so it doesn't represent the University of Washington. I would also like to add that I would, at this moment, wish to acknowledge and recognize that I am an elite Savarna woman from India who has managed to immigrate to this country and cross borders, both internal and external, as a result of the ways in which generations of exploitation and class in the name of neo-feudal and slave forms of caste in the name of sort of elite Savarna well-being have authorized my presence here. And I want to do this because my talk is going to focus on the continuity between internal and transnational borders. We've already seen the way in which the internal borders we associate with indigeneity are part and parcel of a broader sort of legacy of imperial and ongoing imperial conquest. I would like to acknowledge that this is not a peculiar and particular process that is unique to white capitalism, that racial capitalism is part and parcel of multiple locations of capitalism. And so I want to make a connection between those borders and one of the largest flows of labor that you are seeing take place in the world today, trapped at borders. And that is migrant workers in India in the face of COVID, desperately seeking to go home. In Seattle, we have an ordinance where our mayor, in declaring a curfew yesterday, was forced to acknowledge that they would have to be careful how this curfew was implemented, because where do you go if you're homeless in the middle of a curfew? In the same way, stay-at-home orders in India are complicated by the fact that migrant workers lose their jobs, lose food security, live in highly fragile conditions, and are going to suffer unprecedented rates of death. And there is no escaping the relationship between the caste formation of agricultural labor that has been at the center of the agricultural crisis in India, which has caused this massive urban immigrant workforce to show up. Labor rights are essentially non-existent. Only 3 to 4% of India is covered by, of the Indian workforce is covered by formal labor rights. Even those few forms of labor rights are now under attack. It's very clear that states have begun to recognize that India's massive industrial project has been built on the backs of trapped migrant labor. After meeting with construction industry people, the state of Karnataka has acknowledged that while they claim there is no relationship, that they have now essentially prevented laborers from leaving the state because they are worried that once labor leaves these cities, they will not return to become part of the migrant labor. One state, Uttar Pradesh, has already declared that labor rights will be suspended except for a very small handful of rights for 3 years. Other states plan to follow in the name of restarting this economy. The suspension of labor rights includes already the reinstatement of the legality of the 12-hour workday, something that we look back with horror in terms of some of the worst excesses of industrialization when we think of the origins of industrialization. So I think that when you think of that, and you think of those internal borders, and you connect that to the kinds of internal borders that we know now exist, from redlining, from the complete absence of healthcare, from the slow death by poverty, the more rapid death by COVID, and now the even more rapid death by cops, you are beginning to see that a systematic use of both internal and external borders, authorized in the name of citizenship and legitimacy, undergird an existing system of clampdown of all forms of rights, both to labor and off labor, in terms of rights to the state. So it is not merely rights to economy, but also rights to the state that are at peril here, which leaves me with my last point. I think we need to stop discussing the questions of capitalism in terms of a nostalgia for some previous era of a welfare state that never existed, at least not in the ways we'd like to imagine for everyone. This sort of narrative of the markets versus the state is a narrative that imagines the history of capital purely from the perspective of those who have seen the state acknowledge their citizenship and acknowledge their rights. That is not and has never been the way in which class, capital, or state has ever worked. So I will stop there and hand it over to my friends who are going to talk more substantively about these connections. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. You were actually under your time allotment, so my anticipation will be there'll be some more questions coming your way in the discussion afterwards. So next up, we have Dan Denvir. Dan is the host of The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine and author of All American Nativism, How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It. Over to you, Dan.
Hello, can you hear me all right? I'm on my phone, so it's a little funny. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm gonna also keep my remarks brief because I think that discussion in question always proves a lot more fruitful than just presenting ad nauseum on my own work. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about from the research I did for my book is about how the coronavirus pandemic is providing this opportunity for the nativists in power in the Trump White House. Donald Trump, of course, Stephen Miller, his kind of evil genius, nativist goblin mastermind who has been managing his immigration policy, how they've used the coronavirus crisis as an opportunity to enact a sort of nativist fever dream. And to kind of set the context for that, I want to step back to the 1990s, where the war on immigrants as we know it today really emerged full force in national politics. Throughout this, the new nativist movement as we know it really emerges in the late 1970s, organized by a number of different people, but its key leader was this guy, John Tampton, remarkably enough, an ophthalmologist from Michigan, who ended up playing a key role in founding every major nativist organization that exists today: the Federation for American Immigration Reform, U.S. English, the Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA. That all began in the late 1970s. But what they really struggled to do in the 80s was, even though there was widespread anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S., not only among whites, but amongst Latinos and Black people as well, there was strong anti-immigrant sentiment across the board, but they struggled to make it a voting issue, an issue that that politicians could wield against their opponents, cynically to exploit the public fears around immigration. What happened in the 1990s is an anti-immigrant movement really took hold in California. There was a recession after the end of the Cold War. The aerospace industry went into decline, and longstanding anti-immigrant sentiment there exploded into the 1994 campaign for Prop 187, which would have denied social services to undocumented immigrants across the board, including public education. Initially, the ballot referendum didn't get very much attention, but Governor Pete Wilson, the Republican governor at the time, saw correctly, in again, an act of evil genius, the potential of immigration to be a culture war issue, and hitched his reelection campaign to Prop 187. He was reelected and Prop 187 passed. Some of the most draconian measures were ultimately blocked in court, such as the measure that would have barred undocumented immigrants' children from public school. But then it really catapulted into a national issue out of California at that moment. And at that moment, it was anti-undocumented immigrant politics, but it was also anti-legal immigration too. The nativists always saw that undocumented immigrants only never made up a majority of immigrants in this country. And their goal, which was about preserving a certain demographic pattern of a white majority in this country, they saw very clearly that would require significant cuts to legal immigration, not just the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants or militarizing the border to the extent that undocumented immigrants could no longer cross. But what happened in the mid 1990s is in 1996, there was legislation to dramatically cut legal immigration into the country. And that legislation also included major provisions to attack undocumented immigrants and also legal permanent residents, specifically to make huge swaths of people deportable for very, very minor criminal offenses, and to dramatically reduce opportunities to appeal deportation. So there used to be all sorts of ways before 1996 that if you were ordered deported, that you could appeal that and manage to stay in the country. That disappeared after 1996. That also, what also emerged out of 1996 these 3 and 10 years bars that essentially banished you from any opportunity to re-enter the country once you were deported. And so to step back, this legislation initially would have done those things, attacking lawful permanent residents and undocumented immigrants, and hugely cut legal immigration. But what happened was major ethnic and immigrant advocacy organizations in DC, alongside business interests, lobbied to split the bill. And so there was a bill to cut legal immigration, and then another bill, which became known as IRA, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. They became separate bills. The cuts to legal immigration went nowhere, and IRA became law and is to this day one of the most disastrously repressive anti-immigrant laws that we have on the books. And that was the seminal moment, because from then on, cuts to legal immigration were mostly off the table. And the war on immigrants became this performative and spectacular war on quote unquote illegal immigration. So if you ask a lot of people today, if anyone listening has a right-wing uncle or something, and you ask them, are you against immigration? I almost guarantee you, unless they're kind of a self-described white nationalist, that they'll say, no, I'm not against immigration. I just think people should come here the right way. And that is actually a problem for the hardcore nativists, because they don't want people coming here, especially people of color from the global south, coming here at all. So the war on quote unquote illegal immigration took on a spectacular life of its own. For the organized nativists, it was supposed to be a means to an end of more or less shutting off immigration across the board. But what actually happened is we had massive border militarization. We went from about, I don't have the data right in front of me, but I think about 4,000 Border Patrol agents in 1993 to roughly 20,000 today. We went from almost no fencing on the US-Mexican border to over 650 miles when Donald Trump took office. In many places, that fencing looks like a wall. We achieved record deportations under the Obama administration. This consistently escalating pattern of enforcement, both at the border and in the interior, to quixotically prove to both the far right in particular and the right wing in particular and the American public in general that the immigration situation was under control. And that was always framed around undocumented immigrants and the border. So Trump runs for office within that same framework of the war on undocumented immigrants, build the wall. It was all about containing undocumented immigrants, the performative, spectacular repression and exclusion of undocumented immigrants, which made a lot of the organized nativists at groups like the Center for Immigration Studies and Numbers USA nervous, because their goal, again, was to shut off immigration full stop. And they began expressing the correct opinion that the wall was a bit of a distraction from that mission. The cutting legal immigration is not what got people excited at Trump's rallies or on Fox News. It was build the wall. Ahead of the 2018 election, it was the caravan invasion. So Trump found that thanks to decades of the bipartisan war on undocumented immigrants, that the way to mobilize the right-wing base was specifically around undocumented immigrants. But Stephen Miller and others in the allies in the Trump administration deftly began using every administrative lever at their disposal to restrict documented legal immigration, dramatically reducing the number of refugee admissions, enacting a newly stringent public charge rule. All of these things that happened before coronavirus that did begin to significantly chip away at the number of legal immigrants admitted each year into this country. And what they haven't been able to do is win any sort of legislation in Congress that would do that. But they have taken significant administrative actions to cut the number of people legally immigrating into this country, which again is part of a white supremacist racial population politics that truly and pretty explicitly inspire people like Stephen Miller. With COVID-19, this has really accelerated once again into a bit of a nativist fever dream, with travel, cross-border travel already all but shut down at the beginning of the lockdown, Trump has taken the opportunity to turn away all asylum seekers at the border, including unaccompanied minors, which is in flagrant disregard of court precedent, but has so far met with minimal resistance and even really minimal public notice. And he has issued an executive order suspending immigration, not just on the grounds of public health, which of course is a pretext, but on the grounds of immigration posing a threat to economic recovery in the US. And the direction I see this going is scary, because as the spread of coronavirus comes under some sort of control, I mean, who knows where this is going in the global north, we're beginning to see it explode in Latin America. We don't know yet what will happen in Africa. And I'm fairly confident that the Trump administration will use the marginalization of the global south and the global south's lack of access to a vaccine, if one should be developed, to semi-permanently bar large swaths of the globe from immigrating into the U.S. with the racially neutral pretext of national security and public health. And so, yeah, it's scary. And that's all I have to say for now.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Lots of provocations coming forward. So hopefully there'll be a really good set of questions that come up in the chat too. All right, so our next speaker today is Harsha Walia. Harsha is the Executive Director of the BC Civil Liberties Association in Vancouver, British Columbia. She's the author of Undoing Border Imperialism and the co-author of Red Women Rising, Indigenous Women Survivors in Vancouver's Downtown East Side. Take it away, Harsha. Harsha, can you hear us? Okay, maybe we can come back to Harsha. Megan, would you be up for going next? Awesome, great, thanks. So Harsha, if you can hear us, you're gonna go after Megan instead, and I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce Megan. Thanks, Megan. Megan Yarbrough is Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Washington and the author of Green Wars, Conservation and Decolonization in the Maya Forest. Her most recent article in Antipode, a radical journal of geography, is on the site fight at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. Welcome, Megan, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I am really happy to be here in these strange times. I logged on a little bit late because I was sort of sitting with what are the demands from where we are here in Seattle, where there's been significant coverage of protests and debates over the civility of the protesters, but none over the civility of the Seattle Police Department. And I just really briefly, before I get into what I need to get into, I think it's important to say that some of the demands that we're seeing coming out right now have to do with the fact that as recently as 2011, the US Department of Justice found that 57% of the police use of force in Seattle was excessive, and that 20% of the police use of force was unconstitutional. So we are in a moment in which we know that Seattle Police Department is killing Black people and Indigenous people in ways that are unconstitutional. And we're getting the National Guard called in on protesters, even as Mayor Durkan is trying to collaborate with the US Department of Justice to let the city of Seattle out of the consent decree before they have met the requirements to make the Seattle Police Department's actions constitutional. So we're in a deep, deep moment of crisis. And I just wanted to name that before I get into this. And my work, I think a lot about abolition at the intersection of policing and detention and deportation. And in Washington State, that's really important because we passed something called the Keep Washington Working Act. And the goal of that act, even though it sounds like it's about labor, it actually is to protect all undocumented immigrants from being subject to collaboration of local and state authorities with US ICE and Customs Enforcement, unless they have a warrant. And the major carve out to that, the one institution that is actively collaborating with ICE, even in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, is the Department of Corrections. They are actively and avidly sending people who finish up their sentences or who apply for early release into detention centers, even as we know that they are incredibly dangerous. And we see the dehumanization of folks in jails, prisons, and detention centers from everything like, you know, when Washington, D.C. justifies opening back up and saying that community spread is down, the only way that they're able to do that is by claiming that people who are in jails and prisons do not count as part of the community. And therefore, like their lives, their ability to stay safe in the midst of this global pandemic is, it doesn't matter in thinking about community. And as we all know, the virus does not discriminate in the same way that we do. So the workers who go in and out of these jails, prisons, and detention centers are spreading COVID-19. I was going to say a lot of really beautiful things that as I was thinking about my father and my grandfather, but maybe I'll skip those for now. No, I'm going to do it. And then I will pay attention to the time. My original research was really thinking about indigenous land activists in Guatemala. The majority of them speak Maya, so they don't speak Spanish. And they come to the US and they are treated as though, like when I wear a t-shirt that says Chinga la Migra or fuck ICE, as though they know what that means, but they don't actually. And so when we're thinking about signs that get posted in jails and prisons and detention centers in Spanish as a way to help people know what's happening with the virus and what they need to do to keep themselves safe, the folks that I work with who end up in the US actually cannot read those and are reliant upon other folks that they are in cages with to support them. The problem with that, of course, is that colorism and racism and anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness, it exists in detention centers just in the same way as it does in places like Mexico and Guatemala. So they're at significant risk. And I'm increasingly working with asylum seekers and trying to teach them what that means and trying to help them navigate the system in the US as criminalization of Indigenous peoples in Guatemala increases. I first actually came to that work at the Northwest Detention Center, which holds up to 1,575 immigrants daily in Tacoma, Washington, which is about a 40-minute drive from Seattle, where I live. And I went there because I had students whose parents were detained and deported there. And I wanted to be there as a site of solidarity and to recognize that even though it's on a toxic Superfund site known as the Tacoma Tar Pits, that it is a part of our community and those folks are residents. And the minute I went there, I was hooked because there is a giant industrial railroad that runs right next to the detention center. And my grandfather and my father were traqueros. So what that means is that they lived on the railroad. Borders have always been strange to me, and the idea of having a fixed home has always been strange to me. It's part of why I'm a geographer. And I think that some of that is because, you know, my dad, I don't know where he was born, but I know that he lived in a boxcar, and I know that he didn't have a fixed home until he was 16. And I also believe that that's part of the reason why he died a premature death, that it had to do with exposure to industrial chemicals where he worked as a child. I mean, I can't prove it, but this is something I've always wondered about. So yeah, when my grandfather used to cross back and forth from Texas to Mexico, every single time he would go through, he would get sprayed with DDT, right? Because supposedly that was a way to stop the contagion that workers brought with them. But there's this amazing story as he continued to work his way west for the Santa Fe Railroad, where at one point he was trying to get on a bus in, I think, New Mexico. It's apocryphal, I don't know, because he died before I was able to get to know him as an adult. But so before he could get on the bus, they asked him, "What are you?" And he was like, "Well, what are my options?" And they said, "Mexican, Black, or Indian." And he said, "Well, which one will get me on the bus?" and so that's how my grandfather came to be identified as essentially indigenous, together with Pueblo and other American Indian peoples who worked on the railroad. Because he was racialized as potentially indigenous, but dark enough skin that maybe he was Black. But if he was Mexican, he wouldn't have been able to get on the bus. And so that kind of the fungibility of identity that people experience as they cross borders, and their creativity around it, is something I always want to honor when I think about these massive structural forms of state violence. So yeah, we're in this weird moment where, in terms of the Northwest Detention Center specifically, but also in terms of ICE generally, we know that the number of people detained is going down for the first time since the 90s, really. It's kind of wild. So we were getting up to 60,000 people detained per day, and now, best I know, we're probably below 30,000. So for those of us who want to think about a politics of the possible, this is a clear moment in which we say, yeah, we don't actually need to fill all these detention centers, and we could close half of them down, and nothing would really change in this particular moment. So at the same time, a lot of what happens is that the majority of immigrants in the US are visa overstays. Most of the people who are visa overstays are more likely to speak languages like English and Spanish. When I'm thinking about the Americas specifically, and here I'm thinking about the main countries of, so most immigrants who end up in the US are going to be from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But those are not the majority of people who end up here with legal permission as visa overstays. Visa overstays in general are going to be people who are more likely to look like me, so they're lighter skinned. They're going to be more likely to speak English or Spanish. They're going to be less likely to be indigenous, Black, and poor. And those are the folks who are most vulnerable to getting picked up right now and moved directly into deportation proceedings. And so it's really, really stark. And I just want to name that because I work in many formations, including Resistencia, where, we have a lot of folks who are femme and light-skinned and Spanish-speaking bilingual with education who are standing up in solidarity with undocumented folks who are detained and fighting their deportation, as the majority of them are going to be more mask-presenting, more dark-skinned, and more likely to be read as a quote-unquote threat by state police and immigration forces. So we're in this. So in the US, I think, as Dan really clearly drew a through line, right? Like, this is business as usual. We like to say that violence and problems comes from other places, and that their contagion is something that we can control by controlling them in ways that fits in really well with broader nativist politics. In Guatemala and in other countries, that hasn't been the case. So over the border in El Salvador, beginning with, IRA, I think of it as IRERA, but Dan pronounces it a different way. That 1996 law that's really key. What that led to was the massive criminalization and deportation of Salvadoran youth. And at that point, the stigma of being deported in El Salvador became so high that being deported was essentially, you were read as a risk to everyone in your neighborhood and your country. And the stigma of being deported is very, very high, and it placed people's lives at risk. In Guatemala, historically, that has not been the case, and it is becoming the case for the first time in ways that I find deeply disturbing and scary. And this is, just to give you a context, we have this moment where one of the flights that came in from Guatemala into the airport, the president of Guatemala called it el maldito vuelo, like the bad little flight. And people were like, well, are you saying that the people who are deported are bad? Or are you saying that the flight is bad? And there was this huge debate over it, because what we found was that people who were, 2 minutes, good, thank you. Folks who were light-skinned, lived in cities and had access to healthcare were like, we don't want these darker laborers to come in and to bring COVID-19 back into our communities. And it's in this context in which the Guatemalan health minister called the US the Wuhan of the Americas, in such frustration that ICE was knowingly and callously, repeatedly deporting people with active symptomatic cases of COVID-19 into Guatemala. And that seems to be the source of much of the community spread that they're experiencing. On April 22nd, ICE claimed that only 287 people in its custody tested positive for COVID-19, but they only tested 400 people. And so what we have at the same time is that Guatemala stopped accepting deportation flights 3 times in April alone. Each time it was because ICE deported people who were symptomatic with COVID-19 that they didn't have capacity to treat. In one flight alone, 43 people. And so you can see none of those 43 people are showing up in the statistics of ICE testing, right? So over and over again, Guatemala has said you can deport people, but only if there's only 25 people per flight, only if you test them, only if you do these other things. The US is refusing to do that, or rather we say we will do it and then we don't comply. And what's now happening in rural Guatemalan areas is in order to protect themselves and their communities, indigenous folks I work with are actually setting up roadblocks, and they're not allowing anyone who was deported to return to their home community as a way to protect themselves. And this is going to lead to a significant change in concerns around border panic and contagion that comes from the US South in new ways that I don't think we've experienced yet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, next up we have Harsha. Harsha, I did a short introduction for you already, but I'm happy to repeat it now right before you speak. So Harsha Walia is the Executive Director of the BC Civil Liberties Association in Vancouver, British Columbia. She is the author of Undoing Border Imperialism and the co-author of Red Women Rising, Indigenous Women Survivors in Vancouver's Downtown East Side. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to start by acknowledging I'm here in Coast Salish territories, lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And for me, this is vital, not just to situate myself, but particularly when we think about the politics of borders, that we situate that, particularly on Turtle Island, within the context of the development of settler colonialism as an ongoing process. And of course, the ways in which, you know, the entire construction of the border and its development is completely contingent on the processes of frontier fascism, right? So the very expansion and production of the border is reliant on the processes of genocide. And particularly so in this moment of a pandemic, to understand the ways in which biological warfare has also been a weapon of genocide on these lands. And so to understand the particular impact of this moment for Indigenous communities where I'm located and really across these territories. And the second thing that I also want to say and recognize, as we did at the start of this event, is just this current moment of Black-led rebellion for Black liberation and really articulating a politics of abolition and how important that is for the politics of borders and for migrant justice movements for a range of reasons. One is the centrality of Black liberation for all movements, the importance of understanding that for all of us, no matter what. And also when we're thinking about borders, to similarly to situate it within anti-Black violence in the same ways that borders are produced and are rooted in the foundational violence of settler colonialism, they also derive from anti-Black violence. And really, you know, as many have argued, the architecture of border controls really derive from anti-Black laws. If we look at the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which allows and did allow rather slaveholders to kidnap and capture Black people that were escaping into Mexico, or if we look at the Black Codes, which implemented intrastate prohibitions on migration between states, these really are some of the predecessors of border controls that we now see in this kind of transnational arena. So it's really important to think through the ways in which border politics really on these territories are inseparable from settler colonialism and anti-Black violence and are completely bound up. And particularly when we're thinking about abolition, how we think through spatial carcerality when it comes to prisons and borders and police, that these are bound up systems. And even the word, I learned this recently, but the word mob, right, which we know is criminalizing vocabulary, it really comes from the word mobility. It derives from the word mobility. So when we think of spatial carcerality, when it comes to prisons and borders, to think about the ways in which immobility really functions in the same way alongside racial violence and racial capitalism. So I want to say all of those to, again, understand the ways in which the politics of opposing borders doesn't only draw from and is not only in solidarity with, but really is central to abolitionist politics. And when we think of I'm not going to talk too much about the US, I'm going to focus on the global, but I want to say that right now, it's really important how we see this and situate this, because the US-Mexico border tends to be the site of understanding migrant justice politics, right? When in fact, bordering practices occur all across. The US border with the Caribbean is a central site and also was a predecessor for how we understand US border politics. As I've mentioned, its connections to territorial expansion, enslavement, settler colonialism. And right now, people may have seen the news today, but CBP has actually said that they are going to be deploying their forces. So Customs and Border Patrol is going to be deployed as part of the repression that's happening right now all across the country. So we understand that the US Border Patrol its very function extends far beyond immigration enforcement. We saw border agents were patrolling with the military in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were policing Black neighborhoods in the aftermath of Katrina. They were oppressing indigenous water protectors in Standing Rock. And now they're again being deployed in this moment of rebellion. So, there's a homology to domestic and foreign conquest when we're thinking about border politics. So I'll leave it at that in terms of what I want to say about the current US context. There are many more who are there and speaking to that, but allow that as a jumping point to think about how we conceptualize borders globally. And really that, borders are not about demarcating territory in terms of lines or maps. And they're also not as much about a politics of movement per se, but really that they are a key method of imperial state formation, hierarchical social ordering, labor control, and xenophobic nationalism. So borders are not fixed or static lines, which is my first point. They're productive regimes that are generated by social relations of dominance. And so to put it another way, the border is really elastic, right? It's not just about the line of the border. The line can exist anywhere. And increasingly, we see that these lines exist within and far beyond the border. This is important because border governance is increasingly internalized, which is we see the ways in which bordering practices are happening inland, if you will, so coordinated with police forces, for example, or externalized, as we see with the Remain in Mexico protocols with the US. Additionally, the kind of concept of internalization and externalization, I would argue, is really important for Americans to understand, because there's a sense that these kinds of technologies emerge from the US. And it's really important for people to understand the ways in which border technologies are often being imported by the US from other places. So if we think about border internalization and say, for example, the ways in which temporary migrant workers are being policed, those technologies on a global scale, Canada is actually believed to be the model for temporary labor programs. So the new braceros, if you will, that model is being perfected in Canada, even according to the United States. When we think about border externalization, like the Remain in Mexico protocols, those kinds of models are being also perfected elsewhere. So in Europe, European border policies in the Sahel region, which essentially prevents migration across the Mediterranean, which is already the world's deadliest border. And I say deadliest because the world's most fatal border is the Indian-Bangladeshi border, or the Australian processes of offshoring detention to Nauru and Papua New Guinea, where there's an entire externalized regime of detention on other countries. These are the places where these technologies are being perfected. So for me, there's a crucial factor for why we need to be thinking about the transnational because we should be thinking through transnational structures, but really to break through American exceptionalism about how we understand these structures to be made. The last thing that I want to say about externalization is that we know, of course, that imperialism, capitalism, climate change, neoliberalism, that these are all factors for why and how migration is produced, right? That forced displacement is really how we should be calling this, right? It's not about a migration crisis, it's a displacement crisis. But also importantly, externalization is becoming a key method of imperialism itself. So when we have countries like the US externalizing border controls into Mexico, when we have countries like Libya and Mali and Nauru and Niger and Papua New Guinea and Turkey and Sudan that are becoming the front lines and the new frontiers of border militarization, and these countries are being further dispossessed of their resources, their lands are now being used to develop externalized infrastructures of migration control. Their trade and aid agreements are dependent on deportees being accepted back. All of this points to the ways in which immigration diplomacy, which we don't talk about at all, is really the new, I would argue, really the new frontier or the new ways in which pillars of imperialism are being maintained, right? So it's not just the traditional ways in which we might think about warfare or neoliberalism, but immigration diplomacy is a very specific way of maintaining imperialism in our current kind of colonial present is vital. So it's important to think about this not only as a politics of immigration, but as a politics of imperialism that is being maintained when we have these kinds of protocols. The second thing that I would say is, of course, the need to stop talking about migration crises and border crises, but to think about the actual crises of capitalism and conquest and climate change. And that really the concept of migration crisis or migrant invasion or border crisis is an imagined crisis, because the vast majority of the world's displaced people, 95% remain internally displaced or in refugee camps in neighboring countries, right? So really thinking about the racial politics and the imperial politics of what we even think of when we even engage or see this idea of migrant invasion. But really, I think what is most insidious about the migration crisis, if you will, is it's declared a new crisis with Western or other imperial countries who are being positioned as its victims, even though for 4 centuries, 80 million Europeans became settler colonialists across the Americas and Oceanias. 4 million indentured laborers from Asia were scattered across the globe. And the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 12 million Africans. So when we're drawing on these invocations of a migration crisis, not only are colonialism and genocide and slavery and indentureship erased as continuities of violence, but they're also the very conditions of possibility for the West's kind of precious guarded imperial sovereignty, right? So it's really important to interrogate and think through these notions of migration crises in this kind of global context of movement, right? Of how are people moving, who's being forced to move, and what are those trajectories? The third thing, I have 2 minutes, which is great because I have one last point. The last thing that I think is really important to think about with respect to borders is oftentimes the ways in which borders are conceived of is this juxtaposition, right? So we're told that borders are open to capital but closed to people. So simultaneously monetized while being militarized. But really, that's not really an accurate juxtaposition. The free flow of capital requires precarious labor, which is shaped by borders through immobility. So, again, the most kind of salient example of this, I think, is temporary labor migration, which is increasingly becoming the model of migration around the world. And it really proves this requirement. So borders are not closed to people. Borders are closed to the free movement of people. And that's a vital distinction because, again, temporary labor migration really resolves that seeming contradiction by providing a bifurcation and segmentation of the global labor force. And so labor is made precarious. There's nothing inherently, as we know, precarious to labor, right? These are conditions that are made, and the border is a key kind of technology with that. And insourced labor is really the flip side of outsourced labor. So all of the kind of hullabaloo about outsourced labor to the third world, if you will, insourced labor is a flip side of that. And so it's really important, I think, to think about the ways in which we think about migration, what is free migration, and that migration is not really about movement, but it's more important to think about the conditions of movement. And really, this is a historical trajectory, right? So until World War II, which is, not a coincidence, until really the Bracero program in the US, for example, the Department of Labor oversaw the US Border Patrol. So we see how critical the function of capitalism is to border politics within racial capitalism. And so all of this, to conclude, in this moment of the pandemic, all of this, of course, is amplified, right? So border securitization is amplified. 57 countries around the world have shut down their borders to refugees. So it's not just Trump at the US-Mexico border, it's 57 countries. Malta, for days, let a boat drift in the Mediterranean because they said that they were too overwhelmed with the coronavirus pandemic. And over that time, 7 people died of dehydration and another 7 people were presumed dead. This is deadly. The politics of border securitization is deadly for people. So this is happening in countries around the world where the health crisis is a pretext to further border securitization, to further the incarceration of people, to say that, we can't have movement, but as Megan, you were saying, still people are being deported out, right? So deportation flights are somehow still essential. Conversely, flights bringing in migrant labor is still essential, right? So we know that as almost all refugee and visa processing is being shut down, migrant labor that's allowed to come in, H-2A visas are still being processed, right? So those are not contradictions. Those are central to the ways in which border politics function. So I'll end it with that, and thank you all for your time. And really, border politics is so central to our vision for liberation.
Thank you so much for that. So much to think about from what we've heard so far. So I hope everybody's paying attention and there are questions coming in. All right, so our last speaker today is Malav Kanuga. Malav is an assistant professor of anthropology at Stockton University and founding publisher and editor of Common Notions. His research investigates contemporary planetary formations of development and underdevelopment, driving urbanization and migration, global resistance to extraction and enclosure, urban histories of colonialism and capitalism, and the struggles and imaginaries that determine the conditions of possibility of city life and urban futures. Over to you, Malav.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jas, and hello, everybody. I want to also convey a deep sense of gratitude to Philip and Sean for undertaking a very improbable month-long series of gatherings and important conversations. It's no ordinary feat to do that in general, but especially in this context. So I thank them, and then behind the scenes, Kyle and Mike as well. To everyone who's spoken before me, thank you also. I know it's not easy also to line up the time and space for even gathering in this way. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this conversation, so I'm excited to add a little bit to it and see where else we can go in the chat and the discussion to follow. So yeah, so I'll start by mentioning that that I was born on traditional Lenape lands to South Asian immigrant parents, and I think, like so many others, also kind of grew up with a visceral, though confusing, sense of the kind of the forms of anti-immigrant sentiments that would surround me, and also the anti-Blackness that also would accompany ordinary life growing up in this society. And it's really largely my participation in social struggles and movements of a variety of types over the last handful of decades that have really kind of clarified for me what the connections are between those insidious forms of racism, of xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, and anti-Blackness. And so I inevitably arrived. Though it was inevitable, it wasn't intuitive at a kind of border abolitionist perspective. And so what I wanted to do is kind of trace some of the ways in which that border abolitionist politics kind of looks to me, especially in this moment today, but also in a sense to think through, so many of the ways in which the story of this sort of global system of borders and immigration and emigration and the organization of labor under this current phase of capitalism is fundamentally stitched together with a number of different forms of violence. And so Harsha, the ways in which you connected so many important dots in that your incredible and runaway kind of presentation is exactly the kinds of things that I want to think through about exactly those types of interconnections between those the different things that we have to be conscious of and think about, not only in how we think about the border and immigration, certainly not as a problem or a crisis, but also as a terrain of struggle. And so I want to kind of think through and trace some of the forms of those connections that sort of surround the border as a kind of regime of violence. And in fact, to think not just about the kind of violence that surrounds border politics, but rather to think in every one of those moments about what are the kind of possible transformative abolitionist moments of solidarity within them. So I think that kind of orientation to me is also especially important now in this moment when so many of us are thinking quite in a sort of, in a very kind of unequal and uneven way, what it means to survive in this moment of global pandemic, to sort of see the ways in which the crisis of this pandemic is unfolding in horrific and quite violent ways, and further differentiates and exasperates the inequalities that so many of us sort of experience in our everyday life. And so within that kind of politics, also thinking about a kind of a revolutionary form of care, I think is for me one of the starting points of thinking about a kind of border abolitionist politics. So that is to say, to think about the ways in which within a kind of the migrant justice movement, which is one of many places where I've sort of learned this orientation, to think about the necessity of providing forms of care and of refuge, of sanctuary, in fact, of organizing and offering community forms of protection, of mutual aid, and of collective self-defense. Those are fundamental to a kind of border politics and a kind of migrant justice orientation that I think that many of the conversations that the presentations we've had are, I think, fundamentally stitched together with. And so, thinking through in the last 5 years, especially, but really over the last 10 years or so, this kind of emergence of these forms of organizing around community self-defense, the arising of mutual aid as a sort of basic organizing strategy within the migrant justice movement. My experience largely in New York City and the New Sanctuary movement certainly revealed to me those aspects, but also thinking about the forms of rapid response that would emerge around anti-ICE organizing at the neighborhood level, that those forms of care and community self-defense, I think, are fundamentally important, and not only in the kind of context of an increasingly militarized and securitized and policed treatment of immigrants and of migrants in the United States, documented or otherwise, but that also that these kinds of forms of organizing sanctuary and community self-defense themselves are part of a tradition that long precedes and surpasses the moment that we're in now. And in fact, in a sense, one of the touchstones for me to think about this and again, sort of thinking about the entanglements of the sort of the migrant experience and migrant organizing and the tradition of Black liberation, is to think with the Black Panther Party as well, and what in the kinds of programs that they would organize, that they called for, that in their framing were programs for for survival pending revolution. And so to think about what survival in this moment looks like pending revolution, or I think in the ways that I would like to orient the conversation now, survival pending abolition, I think is fundamentally important. And so that form of abolition, of course, it includes the abolition of ICE, the abolition of police widely, the abolition of borders, and certainly in the really vast framework that Harsha offers, the abolition of border imperialism as well. And so I think it's not just my orientation. I've been learning this through my own participation in the sort of recent rise of the New Sanctuary movement as well, that the intersection of sanctuary and abolition is increasingly something that people are taking up in their own organizing as well. And just as a footnote too, I've just recently been looking at Naomi Payek's recent book, Bans, Walls, Raids, and Sanctuary. And I definitely recommend their work on this point too, for outlining a politics of what a kind of abolitionist sanctuary politics looks like. So anyway, so I just wanted to kind of briefly sketch a little bit of what that kind of border abolitionist perspective, entails, which fundamentally emphasizes the importance of sanctuary as a material solidarity in offering care and community self-defense. That is simultaneously a kind of necessity to confront the carceral logics of borders, of detention, incarceration, and again, to think through the kind of the nativist, regionalist, and internationalist kind of aspects of how borders are constructed in this moment. So that is to say, kind of think seriously about the origin story of settler colonialism in this, the ways in which historic and ongoing and recurring forms of settler colonialism that fundamentally shape border politics as we know it in the US. And that in relation to that, also the ways in which border imperialism are fundamentally historically tied to the kind of US sense of nativism that Dan refers to, Dan, in your recent work as well. And so to think about the ways in which a kind of politics of community self-defense, of care, of solidarity in the forms of sanctuary and safety and security has to also then fundamentally confront the carceral logics that are at play everywhere in our life, and then also deepen our historic and kind of ongoing understandings of the ways in which imperialism run rampant throughout this conversation, and therefore to really figure out what it means to connect meaningfully, to adopt not only an internationalist and anti-imperialist commitment, but to really build meaningful connections with popular struggles in Latin America and in fact the world. And therefore also quite related to that, developing a kind of a border abolitionist perspective that is fundamentally committed to learning from and supporting indigenous struggles for self-determination and sovereignty, fundamentally as a consequence of understanding the origins and the maintenance of borders in settler, colonial, and imperialist histories. So that's largely what I kind of wanted to lay out, the kind of necessity for thinking about the kind of interconnections between these, let's say, sort of four pillars or politics of a kind of border abolitionist approach, which is to say something that's fundamentally rooted in everyday practices and certainly movement strategies of developing increasingly powerful and material networks of mutual aid and solidarity that are actually fundamentally able to organize community self-defense, offer shelter and safety and security as the sort of starting point and precondition of building an abolitionist movement. And that fundamentally has to relate to understanding the ways in which carceral society is organized, both not just in the sense of a kind of US centric kind of orientation to understanding the sort of recurring cycles of nativism as they appear and reappear and constantly have to be mythologized and renewed in US history, but understanding how even US history, the US history of nativism itself is fundamentally predicated on regional and global forms of colonialism, settler colonialism, and imperialism. So those are largely the tasks that I think are kind of important to think through as well. And so what I wanted to kind of think about is in a sense, what it would look like, and this I guess would be an open question for all of us to kind of contribute to really think about how organizing can attend to every one of those moments, and to think with Harsha, especially those kind of fundamental connections that you were offering us, and thinking about what a kind of border imperialist analysis looks like. So, okay, I'll leave it at that, and then we'll get into the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Malav. That's an excellent segue to and an opening to the discussion amongst all of you. So I am going to turn it to all of you who've just spoken to engage with one another, ask questions, ask for elaboration, build on each other's arguments. If people have things they want to share or reflections they want to make, now would be the time to do it before we open it up to questions from the chat.
Why don't I go? And I was wondering, just to make this conversation more manageable, if we should stick to the same order, or talk across. I'll let you decide, Jaskiran, just so that we do that. All right.
Sure, that's great. Great suggestion. Yeah. I'm down with that.
So thanks all, and I'm really glad when I went first and I cut my talk short, partly because we started late, and I also, when you start, you're never sure what's going to go. There was such a rich discussion, and I wanted to highlight some things. I'm going to pull up my notes. There was so much going on that I had to make sure I paid attention. And I actually want to start by actually identifying Harsha's point about border politics as a sort of structure that is global and not and historic. And I'd like to start by reminding us, since this is in Seattle, and Harsha, you're talking to us from British Columbia, of the Komaragatsu, which was a ship that was kept outside Vancouver in the name of contagion, right? There was a sort of, oh, there's going to be a spread of disease, the ship cannot come in. And we all know exactly what was going on. That is, the stopping of the ship was a deliberate effort to ensure that people who might otherwise become legal because they had been under the regime of the British as British subjects without interruption would be forced to go to Seattle in order to get provisioning, and that would mean that there would be an interruption in being uninterrupted resident under the sovereignty of the British, and therefore they would lose their eligibility to enter Canada, right? And so I want to remind us that the concerns about health to shut down borders are also not new. It's a very, the TB, the sort of questions of malaria, the images of tropical diseases are part and parcel of this. And I think that they also are used to shut down, as I've noted in India, both internal and external borders. And this is a really crucial point because, as Iman Zainal-Abidin reminds us, we are used to thinking of things as America's border crises or Europe's border crises, which reminds us of the crisis the moment people hit that first world border. But if you rethink this as Africa's migration crisis, that is people sort of in a crisis, therefore seeking to be on the move, it's a very different situation. I'd like to note then that in addition to that, there are 2 or 3 things that are very specific about how you think of abolition politics. I think abolition politics, to the extent that they are related to the politics of the state, have to handle policing, they have to handle immigration, but they also have to handle ways in which, for example, in India, changes to citizenship law effectively generate people who are undocumented. That is, the nation state structure creates the situation of large numbers of people who suddenly become stateless. And we live in a world where you are supposed to have a state that acts as the arbiter of your rights. And if you're essentially, the way you get no rights is to render you stateless or in a location where the state no longer has to maintain your rights. And that legalizes certain forms of dispossession. And so this has been an ongoing problem. So I think you can't show solidarity if you are not willing to. So for me, solidarity is shared risk. That is, it is not enough to share care, you have to share risk. Unless you are willing to risk something to enact a form of support, it's not that much solidarity. And in this context, I want to note that in multiple parts of the world, COVID is being used to criminalize dissent. And that is happening in India. The sort of COVID and the idea of Corona Jihad was essentially used to shut down protests that were going to criminalize migration into India that was coming from Bangladesh, multi-generational. And that we have to remember that many parts of the world actually do not have birth-based citizenship. So an understanding of how criminalization works cannot be centered on an assumption about how citizenship works in different parts of the world. One of the biggest difficulties we've had getting solidarity in the US to these questions of some of the world's biggest borders has been the absolute failure to understand that large parts of the world do not offer you birth-based citizenship. And just so it seems to me that a global solidarity also requires a global knowledge that ignorance is sort of willed it's not accidental. And finally, the sort of revolutionary care politics, I'm going to add one comment that Fred Moten once made, which is very important, I think, for us in this moment, so that we carry it forward. When asked about solidarity and self-defense, and Phil remembers this conversation we've had before, a sort of anxiety people very often have, whether self-help is essentially a neoliberal self-care formation where you are retreating from the state. And this is why I want to remind us the state can only retreat if it was there for you to begin with. Then it's not a retreat of the state if it was never there for you. But also that if we remember different concepts of solidarity, we can distinguish between self-care as mindfulness and self-care as a radical politics. And this is Moten's point, that the point of self-care is not just the care piece of it, but the self piece of it, because it's about what is the self that you are trying to create through this care. Is the self that you generate a self that imagines a form of radical sharing of community-based risk, care, capacity to sort of live the communist, communal, radical, anti-capitalist lives we wish in the here and now. I'm showing my debt here to one of my advisors, Julie Graham, on sort of the need for solidarity economies and alternate economies. We don't have to wait for the revolution. We can tend to each other till then. But I think that act of tending is not neoliberal if you remember that we are creating a different self, that the radical self does not spring like Athena from Zeus's head fully formed. She has to be created. And these are the moments we create her. Thanks.
Jump in, others anyone who has anything to share or reflect.
Are we going in?
Or sorry, go in the order, that's true.
No worries, no worries.
I'm just conscious of the time as well, so keeping track.
Totally. I'm gonna make 5 quick points in response to things people said. This was a lot of interesting things. First, Harsha made the incredibly important point of noting that Trump's executive order banning suspending immigration ended up having excluding guest workers. And that's a very important point, because though the hardcore nativists do want a total shutdown, including guest workers, the fact that Trump ultimately had to issue an exemption for guest workers shows the continued power of capital to dictate the politics of nativism in the US. And that's a really important point. Then 2, critical to emphasize the roots of American nativism, and we could also look at Australia and other places, but in settler colonialism, particularly in the US, the rise of the dawn of modern federal immigration control coinciding with the closing of the Western frontier. And so you see the racial population politics that Paul Freimer in his book, Building This American Empire, details so clearly were just this coordinated, explicit part of westward expansion, becoming subsumed in a way into federal immigration politics with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, gradually expanding to bar other Asian nationalities over the decades that followed, culminating in the National Origins Quotas Act of the 1920s, which had an exemption of the sort that we see today for Mexican workers who were framed as temporary, welcomed as workers, as hyper-exploitable workers, but not as neighbors or citizens, seen as people who would automatically return home, a process which, of course, was set in motion by the US's seizure of the northern half of Mexican territory in the mid-19th century. 3, an important point on the history of public health pretexts and the fears over disease contagion being a through line throughout nativist history. One very important example for this that's rather recent was Bill Clinton soon after taking office in the early 1990s, confining huge numbers of Haitian migrants who were HIV positive to Guantanamo Bay, only forced to release them after a judge forced him to. This judge described it as an HIV prison camp, and the ban on HIV positive migration to the U.S. was only lifted in 2010. Harsha also made a good point about the about immigration imperialism, and one thing it had me thinking about, due in part to a conversation I had from my podcast with Aziz Rana and Asla Bali recently, is that we can sort of map perhaps different forms of immigration imperialism onto different moments of American imperialism more generally. Specifically, what I'm thinking about is the 1965 Hart Cellar Act, which repealed the explicitly racist immigration quota acts and Asian exclusions in 1965, which was very much part of Cold War foreign policy at the time, in the moment of decolonization, where the US was invested in a certain multilateral framework to secure consent. They also, of course, secured dominium through lots of coercion as well, but secured consent through saying, no, we're no longer explicitly stigmatizing sending nations from the global south because through immigration bans and restrictions, because the US was seeking the consent of those nations in its battle with the Cold War. Whereas after the end of the Cold War, we see the rise of a more brazenly unilateralist imperialism where all the principled pretexts of the Cold War are increasingly done away with, which Trump, of course, is an apotheosis of. So we see the invasions of Iraq and the war on terror coinciding with the U.S. government cooperation, imposition onto Mexico of the Programa Frontera Sur, which is basically commandeering third-party governments as proxy border patrol and ICE agents. So I think we can kind of map like coincidences of U.S. foreign policy and immigration policy pretty neatly in that way. And then lastly, I think Wendy was talking about this, but just to bring things to where we are today with the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the war on immigrants has always been, the contemporary war on immigrants has always been fundamentally the war on crime as well. All of the major legislation and politics in the 1990s that was explicitly targeting Black people was also very much targeting immigrants, iconically represented as the Mexican immigrant at the time. And so was the war on welfare. All the anti-welfare legislation and politics simultaneously targeted Latino immigrants and the iconic Black welfare mother. In policy terms, what that created was the system of crimmigration. From IRA in 1996, we get its Section 287G, which is activated under George W. Bush, which allows police departments, sheriffs, jails all over the country to become proxy ICE agents, including people like Joe Arpaio, the Maricopa County Sheriff. We see secure communities becoming the signature program under Barack Obama, which turns every single jail in the country, commandeers every single jail in the country as a front door to the deportation pipeline. And so we see the criminal threat and the immigrant threat being described as a joint threat, which is then what allows Trump, erects this political framework through which Trump's grotesque proclamation that immigrants are rapists and criminals resonates with a disturbingly large swath of the American public. That resonance machine was constructed by his predecessors. And I'll stop at that.
Okay, so if we're going in order, I'm next. That was a lot to process. The only thing I would say, Dan, to sort of maybe gently push back on your point about the Plan Frontera Sur is that when we think about these kinds of border politic programs in which there is the externalization of borders, that Mexico has a particular incentive to participate in the Plan Frontera Sur. And in order to understand that, you have to really grapple with the ways in which xenophobia and racism is not specific to the US and Canada and other Anglo nations, but that Mexico also has its own particular politics of xenophobia, racism, anti-Blackness, and anti-indigeneity that it deployed via Plan Frontera Sur with US money. And I think it's really important for those of us who are thinking about how can we enact a radical politics of mutual aid and collective self-defense in the ways that Malav was asking us to do, that part of that means that we have to acknowledge the difficulties within the communities that from the outside we seem like we could easily be acting together, but that in fact there are some significant differences and ways in which the figure of US imperialism has often been mobilized, particularly in terms of Latinx politics, as a way that other folks have enacted harm amongst each other without really taking responsibility for our complicity in anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And I think I just really want to sit with that and be really attentive to that, because sometimes people just want to raise their hands and be like, the US is the cause of everything that is terrible when we're thinking about like Mexico and Latin America. And I think that's maybe a bit simplistic in terms of offering less agency to folks than I think they actually are employing, particularly when we're talking about state agents. And so with that, I did kind of want to just shift away from the negative and towards what I think I was hearing Malav really say about how do we rethink what the politics of the possible is and rethink what revolutionary care and mutual aid looks like in this moment. And in order to do so, we have to bring together these three different ideas that oftentimes I experience as conversations that we're not explicitly trying to have together. So anti-imperialism, indigenous sovereignty, and abolition, and understanding that these are projects that are not necessarily always easy to bring together, and that there are significant conflicts in ways that I just mentioned in terms of Mexico needing to, and therefore also Mexicans and people of Mexican descent in places like the US needing to really grapple with our own racism and what that means for our possibilities and limitations of enacting mutual aid. But to also just say that we have amazing examples that we can draw on. So when I'm thinking about the imperial drive of the US to move to the West, we know that, in terms of maroon geographies, for example, you can really think about, if you rethink the figure of the Lone Ranger to be a Black man who didn't want to be a slave, who learned multiple indigenous languages and was given aid and also collaborated with indigenous peoples who accepted him and invited him in, like that story tells us something different. And we can see that if we read each other together. So, amazing Black geography scholar Clyde Woods and the ways in which Jody Bird engages with his work to say, okay, well, so here's a new way of understanding the South that imagines indigenous and Black communities together, living together and cooperating together. So rather than imagining a future without having this historical precedent, it's saying, what if we go back and we pull from Raymond Williams and Ruthie Gilmore, like what if we reselect the ancestors and the stories that offer us new ideas for the future? And that's what when I look at Ruthie Gilmore and the way that she's now reframing abolition for us, that's what I see happening. And I think it's really inspiring. The other historical moment that I always want to sit with in this work is, that oftentimes when we talk about a frontier politics in the US framework, we think about that as just moving westward. And of course, because of my perspective, I think a lot about moving southward. And so particularly the Confederados, I think many people are not familiar with this, but there was a major plan for the Confederates to build their empire south, not just in Brazil, but throughout Central America. So at first, the idea was that they would take over all of the US and then incorporate Central America. But as it became clear that they might not be able to take over the US, there were a series of white men who wanted to retake conquest of independent nation states and name them. So William Walker in the 19th century named himself King of Nicaragua. And the reason why this is amazing is because it's important to understand that whether we're talking about the US-Mexico Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the ways in which Mexico insisted that none of its people be re-enslaved, or whether we're talking about William Walker naming himself King of Nicaragua and reinstating slavery after it had already been abolished, the US is known in Latin America as having this particular kind of attachment to chattel slavery and forced labor in ways in which many of us, in terms of communities of color, have not fully grappled with. Here's what's amazing about William Walker and why I love to tell his story, though, not just because he's the bad guy, but because of the ways in which many communities that previously do not collaborate. And when we're thinking about what, Belize and Guatemala still don't agree, that some people in Guatemala might not think that Belize is a country. They certainly don't agree on their borders. And there's a lot of back and forth around anti-indigeneity on the part of Belizeans and anti-Blackness on the part of Guatemalans, even though the people themselves who are indigenous, Black, or both, because in Latin American terms, those are obviously not mutually exclusive, and they don't understand our formations around that. So the people themselves live across the borders, but the national leaders in Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras often did not collaborate in the 19th century, but they sure did to kick William Walker out. And so, he tried to just sort of take over. And there's this historical moment when everybody brought their own flags in order to his estate. And there's this story that a Guatemalan officer ran into the Walker estate and stole William Walker's flag to symbolically take Nicaragua back from him and to eject him and his imperial slavery politics. And he said, "Filibuster bullets don't kill." And it was one of the few times when people came together to express solidarity and self-determination against this harm. And I think for many of us who are coming up in these COVID-19 mutual aid groups, we're seeing communities that previously hadn't collaborated or understood their struggles as tied, understanding the ways in which they are tied. And so what I want to say is that these formations are happening now and that they've happened historically in ways in which I find incredibly fascinating and important and inspiring, that I think speaks back against this claim of a border politics, or against the idea that abolition and decolonization are and have always been separate projects, in ways in which it doesn't mean it's not difficult, but that this is work that we have done before and we can continue to do. Thank you.
I think Harsha and Malav, if you have things to share, go ahead. Go ahead, Harsha.
Sure, thank you. Sorry, my video was just a little stuck there again. Thank you all for those comments. I just have a series of notes. They might be a little bit disjointed. One thing, just picking up on the last conversation in terms of these kind of entanglements and the ways in which we think about anti-imperialism, borders, decolonization, and abolition as entangled projects, right? So distinct, but still working through each other. There's so many ways in which we're talking about that. And the one that perhaps is obvious, but I don't think we've explicitly stated, is also the ways in which even just the category of migrant that we think of have in kind of popular imagination typically doesn't include, for example, Black and Indigenous people, when in fact, of course, that's not true. Again, thinking transnationally about, the majority of displaced people, but even in terms of thinking about the politics on this continent, if we think about the ways in which after NAFTA in particular, the number of Indigenous people specifically who were displaced from Mexico, but also, of course, through Central America, a growing number of people who are coming from Central America, from Guatemala, El Salvador, etc., Honduras, are increasingly Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people, Garifuna people, and also the ways in which criminalization, so we're talking about the 1996 laws and, the increasing merging of immigration and criminalization. And as we know, Black Alliance for Just Immigration has consistently documented the disproportionate impact of, stop and frisk, criminalization, detention, deportation, and these policies of criminalization on Black migrants, right? So African, Caribbean, and Black migrants. So also to think about the ways in which the identity of who is a migrant has historically left out the impact on Black and Indigenous people. So that's another way in which we can really think through about the entanglements of these processes, in addition to the structural ways in which borders are made through settler colonialism and abolition that I think is important. And there's so much history there, but just because Dan mentioned the national origins quota, right? So that's the 1924 legislation. One of the key things that we also don't often talk about with the 1924 legislation is that piece of legislation and the Indian Citizenship Act also that same year, but the ways in which that legislation and the ICA actually made indigenous peoples living in the United States as essentially forcibly American citizens, right? So these are, again, parallel processes in terms of how citizenship is made, who is forced to assimilate, who is excluded, etc. So thinking about, again, the ways in which these are made together. Another point to the Kamagata Maru, to add to the really important mention of that history, in addition to the ways in which that was about, transnational politics and the ways in which the British Empire was controlling, racially defining British subjects, was also the deeply anti-imperial, anti-colonial politics of how the Kamagata Maru played out, right? So one of the additional key pieces, in addition, to the fact that it was predominantly sick migrants, the idea of contagion and disease, as you mentioned, but also that it was believed that many of the people on the boat were members of the Ghadar Party, or had affiliations with members of the Ghadar Party on the West Coast, right? And the Ghadar Party being historically one of the most incredible examples that we have of transnational anti-colonial politics and formations. It was founded on the West Coast as a South Asian anti-colonial formation, but had nothing to, was rooted in South Asia, but its formation was here on the West Coast. And that was also part of the exclusion. So speaking again to the ways in which anti-imperial politics and really that the geopolitics of migration and the refugee order, in addition to the Red Scare, really we can trace to, anti-imperial and anti-colonial politics. But really the Red Scare is central to the formation of international institutions. So, the very definition of who is a refugee under the UN Convention, the very formation of the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, also in the 1950s, these massive international organizations to manage refugee and migrant kind of flows as they imagine themselves doing is completely informed by the Red Scare, right? So who's defined as a refugee in the 1950s and 1960s were people who were fleeing communist regimes. And most starkly in the United States, of course, we see the welcoming of Vietnamese refugees, but the lack of welcome, if you will, for refugees fleeing from Central America, fleeing from Haiti, and then, of course, white wealthy Cubans are accepted, but Afro-Cubanos, sex workers were explicitly, were denied. So the ways in which the geopolitics of who's accepted and who's not is such a key part of the refugee order. The other piece that I wanted to mention was birthright citizenship, also to the point of, how in the transnational moment we understand birthright citizenship and statelessness. And I think particularly in the United States, again, this is another way in which really there's a debt of the immigrant rights movement to Black-led struggles, and specifically to Black struggles when it comes to birthright citizenship, right? So the emergence of birthright citizenship in the United States comes from the 14th Amendment, which really was rooted in emancipation struggles. So we also see the ways in which, there are many ways, but just because we were talking about birthright, the ways in which there's a very specific debt and social organization of citizenship that is rooted in Black struggles. But also connectedly to the point of statelessness, we also see that the world's largest kind of stateless population and the world's oldest, rather I should say, stateless population are Palestinian people. And that's what the UN calls the most protracted stateless situation, which of course is UN jargon garbage, but really we can trace to Zionism, right? To the Al-Nakba, to 1948. And so even in the ways in which statelessness is produced, not only as a function of citizenship and who's left out, but again, through this trajectory of imperial settler politics, and we can't separate it from those kinds of formations. The last two things that I wanted to mention to the really important point about how we think of border politics and how we think of imperialism, I think is an important one. when I'm thinking about it both in the kind of traditional sense of imperialism, right? So the ways in which, a lot of US leftists think of US as the only imperial force, but I take the point, and I think it's important that we complicate it more. And, just to add to the important point made about the role of Mexico, particularly its relation to Central America and other countries, and to think about that more critically, if I'm understanding that point correctly, is I think the same translates to Europe, right? So Turkey, for example, is seen right now as the kind of frontier border guard for Europe, so the EU-Turkey deal, where Turkey has essentially accepted the externalization. I mean, some of that fell apart the last few months. We won't go into that. But the EU-Turkey deal is really seen as one of the key ways in which the EU has externalized its border to Turkey, amongst other countries, in order to shut the border down to Syrian refugees in particular. But of course, that's not only a function of European imperialism or a European colonialism, but I think it also requires us to take into account the very specific history of Turkey in relationship to the region, right? So it's not only about European imperialism, but to me, what I see that doing is I see, for example, the US and Mexico, or Europe and Turkey, is not only a function of American or European imperialism, it's also allowing and facilitating the building up of authoritarian regional powers, or shifting regional power politics, right? And so what that's meant for in Turkey for an authoritarian dictator like Erdogan is millions and millions and millions of euros in order to continue his authoritarian regime, right? Whether it's in Rojava or elsewhere. So it's not simply about thinking about imperialism in that kind of traditional sense of power blocks, but thinking also, importantly, as you mentioned, about those kind of regional politics and all the different nuances that requires us to attend to. This is like a random also side note that I think is interesting, because there was mention of Joe Arpaio and the 287 agreements. And the thing that I've always found really interesting in tracing the trajectory of people like Joe Arpaio, is he was one of the architects of the first Operation Intercept under Reagan. And so when we follow people like him, we see, again, how the war on drugs is related to the war on crime, is related to the war on poverty, is related to the war on terror. Like, these are all incarnations of each other, right? And that they produce the same kind of social formations, just continuously escalating and reconfiguring themselves. And then the very last thing was just the politics of care and risk and alliance. And I won't add much there, but just about how necessary it is for us to tend to these in terms of thinking through them, but also how we build politics is through practice. And, that's perhaps stating the obvious, but really that we make politics by doing politics, in addition to thinking about politics, but how important that is. And this is, for me, it's just so central. This wasn't part of my bio, which was my fault because I didn't send it in. But for, most of my organizing is in the context of practice. And so how important that is about how we think through things. And for me, if there was a brief period of time where I was living without status and was incarcerated in a detention center here in Canada. And during that time, it was alliance and solidarity building with Indigenous communities here on the West Coast. And at the time when I was under a removal order, it was Indigenous communities, particularly the Secwepemc community, who offered me the kind of seemingly symbolic, but really deeply meaningful gesture of acceptance and membership into their community and into their nation. And so it's those kinds, and there's many other histories of that. I'm only speaking of my own, but the ways in which we also remake the idea of citizenship and really take it outside the realm of state-defined citizenship and rethink membership and rethink relations as really grounding the idea of citizenship, right? The idea of belonging as really connected to responsibility, as connected to our ethical relations, and really connected to the idea of prefiguring social relations and community in a different way. So I think to that, citizenship is also so vital because it forces us to rethink the idea of, who belongs to whom. And so, I just wanted to end with that because it really is such a politics of practice as well. So thank you all for this incredible conversation.
Malav.
Okay, well, I'll just maybe just say one thing, just to continue the conversation around the politics of practice, that I very much rely on, like, our ability collectively to resolve all of these questions before us, fundamentally through the level of organization we have. So that's largely the orientation that I'm drawing from, and I think that kind of question, all of us in different ways in these comments have kind of posed around the kind of the difficulties of actually kind of relying at a political level on maintaining these kind of intersections, of understanding what it means to organize within these kind of intersections. I think is it's the challenge. My kind of approach is guided, I think, in part learning with the kind of evolving project of the Abolition Collective to try to really kind of name the kind of evolution of a number of different abolitionist movements and tendencies, and to look at what those kind of intersections are between them, which is not just a kind of rhetorical project at all. Of course, it's about really sitting in and grappling with the kind of the tensions and the contradictions between those movements, but the sort of spaces of possibility as well with them. And and so in some ways, if the starting point is to think about the kind of the sort of sequencing of violence throughout the kind of that necessitates and structures the kind of migrant experience, that journey, let's say, through in the kind of US and South American context, that structures migration upward, to like look at that kind of sequence of violence, and sort of you think of so many different reasons and causes of how people kind of are thrown into that, or kind of churned up in so many ways and kind of set loose, and and to try to look even along that journey how fundamentally related those different forms of structural violence are to one another, even though the kind of the forms, the manifestations of them, have they take on different expressions of absolutely devastating kind of a crisis of femicide, or indigenous repression, of just a kind of war on people through the sort of cartelization of people's experiences of life, is sort of what's often referred to. And Megan, you've sort of, I think in some of your work, has allowed us to understand how this works in Guatemala also, the sort of entanglements, the sort of paramilitarization of land, of the kind of war on people, indigenous people, especially, Megan, in the context that you're describing, as part of a land grabbing thing. I mean, the ways in which kind of routine reform, I mean, even the sort of seemingly innocuous, the sense of like structural adjustment that comes from NAFTA and FTAA and a number of other kind of trade agreements, accompanies the most brutal forms of violence as well, all of which is meant to, in part, not only so-called get the goods, but also kind of produce layers and layers of people who are perpetually displaceable. And, even though that story looks different, and in every one of those moments, there are different important struggles that are kind of maintained to defend people at that level, there are also, I think that there are possibilities, and this is largely the kind of grand collectivist project that I'm sort of finding my way in, to sort of think about what those connections look like. And I think in some ways, we could sort of perhaps think about the forms of solidarity that arise at these different moments are also those points of making those connections, because that's largely, and Charu, I take your point completely, that those have to be kind of moments of, or that they're materially moments of risk. That those moments of solidarity, really asking that question, Harsha, if you're asking, of like, who belongs to whom? What are our responsibilities to each other? How do we actually take care of ourselves, is actually learning how to do that in spite of all the ways that we were simultaneously, and this is quite like the paradox, simultaneously divided and ruled, created as sort of differentiated access to resources and other things, and then also fundamentally suffering the same condition as well. So thinking about the kind of that paradox, I don't think that, I mean, I'm not sure where analytically we would find that, but I think fundamentally, and this is, I think, just to echo the point that everyone's made so far already, that the point where we go to find, articulations of this is in struggles themselves. And I think that's the reason I wanted to kind of highlight the ways in which care and solidarity isn't just a sort of gesture or an expression in politics. It's fundamental to our ability to know both the forms of oppression that we are seeking to dismantle and abolish, but also the ways in which we are going to do that. And then, of course, the ways that we're going to create a world for ourselves that is actually livable.
Thanks so much, everyone, for all of those reflections. This has been a really robust and meaningful and inspiring conversation. There are a few questions. We have a little bit of time left, so there's some really good questions that have come in from the chat. So I just want to throw a couple of them out there, and then hopefully we can. I'll hand it over to Philip and after we answer those, and then he'll close out the event. So the first question I wanted to pose to you that came from the chat is, what do compositions of sanctuary and self-defense look like now, and where are they heading? So sort of people looking for material examples of all of the things that you've just been talking about. Anyone have thoughts about that?
I was just going to ask if we want to take questions together, if you're short on time, if you think that's useful.
Sure, we can do that. So another question that came forward was, and Harsha, this one's directed at you specifically. So given the domestic and foreign homology of conquest, would you historicize the elasticity of bordering more recently, or has this been the case for some time? Another question directed to you, Megan, was specifically about wanting to hear more about why the numbers in the Northwest Detention Center have gone down recently. So a very specific question about that comment in your presentation. So I'll leave it at that and we'll see where we land. So the first one is about sanctuary.
Why don't I speak to solidarity and someone can speak to sanctuary, because I think they're related, but not the same. In terms of experiments, I will just direct you to the US Solidarity Economy Network and to some of the global movements for solidarity. And what I like about these movements has been, it has become very clear to me that a lot of the self-help or solidarity that came around COVID didn't just happen out of charity. It actually came out not from the philanthropy side, but from sort of networks that had already been created and were nurtured. And many of them have their origins. So I won't do a global map or a map across the world. There is such a map. I won't do a US map either. But there are 2 points I'd make about it. Studies in Philadelphia of the co-op movement have shown solidarity cannot just look at self-help. The study by Safri St. Martin et al. Of Philadelphia co-ops, where they mapped them, showed that unfortunately the cooperative movement is as racially segregated as other movements. So if you are in a white-owned co-op, very often you are not redlined. You have a different clientele base. If the city is geographically sort of segregated, then the sort of sustainability of where you can do things is shifted. So in a city like Seattle, this matters a lot because we are seeing gentrification re-segregate a city that barely managed to desegregate because of its long history of redlining. And I think that if we see of who's been really important, I'd like a very specific shout out to Community up in Bellingham. They have been central to fighting against the H-2A visa. They have been crucial for winning one of the very first state-level contracts for workers' rights in farming since the Cesar Chavez United Food Workers. And the reason this matters is because they have been very clear that they see themselves as a food justice movement and that they see a tight connection between ecological environmental, indigenous, decolonial, and anti-capitalist solidarity. Down in Tacoma, Hilltop Urban Gardens has linked food security to the question of the carceral state. So I really want to make this point that one of the reasons we have these groups has been long action, which far predates the crisis. And in fact, the crisis is being handled by them. I'll let people speak to others, but this part of the world, I think Red May has got to at least name those two. Thanks.
I think if it's okay, I might just hop in there because that's sort of a region-specific question. And I also wanted to name that, for people like me, some of the ways in which I first came to know community to community and their work was because one of the ways that growers or plantation owners tried to stop workers from organizing was by using immigration enforcement as a tool. And so many of these organizers who wanted and succeeded in unionizing ended up in the Northwest Detention Center. And that was a key site that brought farm worker organizing and unionizing into this detention space as an organizing space that was just, I think it was really important and vibrant, and it's something that many of us are still learning from. And I also just, I want to give a shout out because Hilltop Urban Gardens also shares office space with La Resistencia, and so you can see the ways in which not only are we talking about the ways in which these different formations and organizations are cooperating with each other to enact an abolitionist vision, but part of that is by literally sharing space with each other and having meetings together. And there's a lot of sort of organic work that happens when you're just constantly in meeting spaces together. And I think that's been one of the really key things that's happening. And as my friend Angelica Chastero always reminds me, when we fight, we win. And so I think this is what's so important about understanding and why I wanted to emphasize, like, hey, the numbers of people being detained are going down. Things in detention centers right now are absolutely terrible. And it's really scary and it's really dangerous. That said, the fact that the numbers of detention are going down so much is something that isn't getting a lot of popular attention. And part of that is because CBP and ICE are not really publicly acknowledging that this is something that they are doing. They're not publicly acknowledging that there have been a number of lawsuits and temporary restraining orders in which judges have said, oh yeah, actually detaining people in situations in which it's clear that you are placing them at risk of death, maybe that's not constitutional. Maybe you're going to have to let people go. And that is really important because unlike some of the other regional formations that we've seen in the state of Washington last year, when we came together for the first time to talk about what would it look like to ban all forms of private detention in Washington state, you had folks who were sort of more moderate, who were sort of like, well, maybe we just need better detention conditions, for the first time coming together and saying, yes, we are willing to go for shutdown. So these moderate groups that are nonprofits that get money directly from the city of Seattle and King County and other places that, as we've seen with our, given that I'm on a 5 o'clock curfew today, are really not open to a lot of broader social movements. Even though they are beholden to them as funders, they're still able to come together in this moment and say, hey, this form of violence is one that we think should end, and they're willing to do so publicly. And so that, for me, is a key context into which we can see the numbers of people who are being detained at the Northwest Detention Center going down, in which for the first time, Tacoma City Council and even actually one of the executives of Geo Group, which is the private company that owns and operates the Northwest Detention Center, it wasn't until 2017 that he had to publicly acknowledge and try to justify the existence of this massive detention center. And that, to me, really marked a turning point. The turning point is when we say, is not when we say, how many people do we need to detain? Do they have the right to lawyers? What does that look like? What are their conditions? But instead we say, why is this here? Do we need this? And that is really, really crucial to me. And I just want to remind people that even though ICE and CBP are not publicly acknowledging it, that these pressure tactics are working. And in fact, I would argue that the reason why they're not publicly acknowledging it is because they are scared, because we are beginning to win. And I think this is a crucial moment where we can lock in some of the wins that we've got and build on them.
Just to follow up, I want to, sorry, I'm just so excited that we're raising this. So I want, when people hear me say solidarity means shared risk, they have this bizarre imagination that I'm telling them, unless you're willing to die by bullets and so on. And I am the worst coward. I cannot even take an injection. I am not going to tell anyone to sort of necessarily risk physical violence or anything like that. But the risks I'm talking about that keep us frightened are things like you're afraid of funding. You're afraid a grant will not be met. You're afraid that the Gates Foundation may be unhappy with you. I mean, there are fears which I will not dismiss as genuine, because absolutely the coercive arm of the state is a terrifying thing. If it wasn't that terrifying and it was that easy to face that violence, we would not be against these horrible things. But sometimes the things that it takes to turn something is actually the solidarity where you're willing to take these smaller risks and at least start there. I think that is absolutely right, that it was the shift in the moderate groups that has been crucial. And it has been the work of the more sort of strong abolitionist groups that has helped make that turn.
Yeah, well, I think you can maybe get a map of that sort of shared risk as solidarity thing in thinking about all these different kind of groups that have emerged, and especially the last 5 years around sanctuary, but not exclusively under the kind of rubric of sanctuary, or at least not the kind of new sanctuary movement kind of aspect. But certainly there is, and I'm not exactly certain of I'm not sure that there is a map. I certainly don't have one in my head of the status of the kind of wider new sanctuary movement and what they've offered. But I'm sure there's a dedicated website that speaks to it. There was a kind of rapid rise. I mean, the new sanctuary movement has kind of been around. Perhaps it's needless to say, but long before Trump. But there was a rapid rise, of course, in that sort of coordinated campaign nationally in the fall of 2016 and the winter of 2017. So many of those projects, of course, still exist. They're I imagine fraught with their own kind of limitations organizationally and and other things. But they are part of a map, I think, that also connects to a number of other sort of sanctuary practices. Some of which are also connected to the ways in which the new sanctuary movement has operated in a sort of sense of kind of offering shelter according to that sort of the sort of so-called sensitive places kind of memo that ICE had put out as a sort of guideline of where ICE agents were not readily going to conduct their raids and arrests and things. So churches being a sort of mainstay of that, hospitals, universities as well. And so largely the sort of like above ground new sanctuary movement largely kind of maps onto those types of spaces. But I mean, I think even within that, there are a bit more ephemeral and informal, but still fundamentally important kind of sanctuary organizing at the university level. Certainly at the kind of rescinding of DACA and that specific moment, a handful of years ago, but I know that there's an ongoing concern with student groups across the country around those things. So there's an enormous sort of youth-led, undocumented kind of movement that remains there. I mean, for obvious reasons. There's also a much more enormous and harder to map kind of subterranean aspect to these movements. So there is something of a kind of underground railroad of a network of houses and other like community spaces and things that are routinely offering sanctuary at that level. But I think before you kind of Yeah, think about just that sort of one moment of kind of at the moment when one or individual or family or group is seeking sanctuary or needing sanctuary in that moment, that there predates that a kind of long continuum of organizing efforts to support people in the community. And so what I was seeing that comes to mind in thinking at a kind of panorama of sanctuary politics that actually have a kind of materiality to how they support people is, in that sense of community self-defense, there's very much a kind of conscious emergence of those things also in the last 5 years or so, of kind of organizing rapid response to ICE raids and ICE arrests in neighborhoods and certainly workplaces. There was, some of these things might have been episodic, of course, like the airport protests against the Muslim ban was another example. But I think what's interesting also is to trace that a lot of those things, and then of course the much more longstanding kind of project of solidarity, mutual aid that you'll find in the Sonora Desert, in terms of No More Deaths and a number of other initiatives that deal with, which have their own risks, of course, and certainly as, folks from No More Deaths are federally prosecuted and things, that there are absolutely risks to this type of work as well, that type of solidarity, but that there is a kind of whole, I think, learning of these different forms of community self-defense and solidarity that kind of travel from context to context, neighborhood to neighborhood, perhaps school to school, but also, in the ways in which there's been longstanding eviction defense that is part of this very same network that I'm talking about, or community bail programs and other. In fact, also in the fall of 2016, we were seeing the same type of sort of organizing around sanctuary and anti detention and deportation kind of politics that were directly connecting with water protectors and Standing Rock. And so there is actually a much larger kind of, let's say, repertoire of solidarity and community self-defense, or the community defense of, let's say, vulnerable people, or of land or water or other things, that I think forms the kind of larger context of these things. And I think part of this is thinking about how those forms of organization, like thinking compositionally about those things, that there is a kind of rise and fall to certain expressions of it. But I think that the kind of the relationships that are formed in those experiences and the knowledge that emerges from those things don't just go away, that they kind of continue on in other forms as well. So in some ways we can expect to see them arise at different moments as well. I saw them yesterday in Center City in Philadelphia, certainly also in the ways in which people were out and protesting, but also creating kind of absolutely necessary and vital forms of community self-defense around charging police. And so we sort of see a kind of whole protest cycle that has learned across these different struggles and these different movements a kind of tactics of taking care of people along the way. And I think that just looks like a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. So it's a great question to ask compositionally how to map it. But yeah, in some ways I think part of that is experiential, and so therefore a bit ephemeral, and then other parts of it it would be a much larger collective political research project to kind of really do map it. But I think it's an important question to answer directly.
Great, thank you all for that. Just in the interest of time, I know it's a little bit past, or 20 minutes past the time that we were supposed to end. So I don't know, Harsha, if you have like a very quick, short answer to that question that was posed about elasticity, but now would be the time to jump in, and then I'm going to hand it over to Philip to close out the event.
Sure. Short answer is yes. Yes, and I think also that borders are, in terms of their association with nation states, are new. I think we have to remember that before we were looking at the ways in which empires governed. Of course, we still have empires, but the actual formation of nation states is only certain decades old. So if the question is historically, I don't know how far back they mean by historically, but absolutely yes. Short answer.
Thanks so much. And apologies to the rest of you who asked really excellent questions in the chat, but maybe you can reach out to the speaker that you're interested in engaging with and send the question their way. I want to thank all of you for sharing your reflections and commentary and for being part of this today. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Philip, to close it out. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jaskiran, and thanks to all of you. It's wonderful to have panelists who can move easily from the ground level experience of organization and resistance to broad overviews of capital's need for precarious labor in racially segmented populations, or the ongoing project of settler colonialism in the US, Canada, and Israel, Palestine. So, and also I want to say personally that this panel had to be rescheduled. It almost didn't happen. Some people left, someone came in, and it's just like destiny that we brought together this kind of ideal group of relational thinkers to have this conversation in a country of kind of pseudo-innocent empiricism where every event presents itself as coming from nowhere. Oh, we've got this caravan of refugees from Central America on our border, you know, and even journalists don't bring up Reagan's genocidal wars in Guatemala and Salvador. So, you know, it's just a delight to have found chemically, artistically, this group of people that seem destined to talk to one another. And I want to thank you all for your patience in sticking together to make it happen through all sorts of errors, which were entirely on the fault of me in terms of not getting back with emails. So thank you again, Harsha, Malav, Jaskiran, Megan, and Charu, and Dan, Denvir, wherever your phone has dropped you to. It's a wonderful conversation that I'm sure people will enjoy looking at again and again when it floats out in YouTube. This is the last day in May. This is our last event in May. So technically, we've really come to the end of Red May. And so it's my last chance in May to make a pitch for your financial support. You know, an event, one of whose slogans is "Be a commie for a month," doesn't have a lot of institutional support. In fact, we have none. We depend on the kindness of strangers. We are, as I say, like Blanche Dubois. We're asking you to go to www.redmayseattle.org, click on donate, give what you can. We're at 3,800. If we can get over 4,000, we're a third of the way towards doing the event next year. And next year, by the way, amazing, will be our 5th year of this madness. So sustain us, go to Red May Seattle, Red May TV on YouTube, and you can donate there, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We just need a few more subscribers to get over the hump to have live CC captions for the differently abled. And thank you once again for attending all of the events that you did and following us through the month. And may you now go and join in your cities, the uprising, however it's being enacted, and stay safe. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.